Hey class, and welcome to our lecture on ethics. Some of you may have noticed that I moved this topic up from later on in the course to this week. I did that intentionally. It wasn't a mistake. I didn't forget the order of the courses, but I did it because I think that what we're going to tackle this week is perhaps the most important discussion we're going to have all semester. And it's focused around how do we use generative AI ethically. Now, I think it's important to do that before we start using ChatGPT to write outlines, to create images, or to build business plans. It's important to establish the kind of relationship that we want to have with AI. To be clear, this is not a doom and gloom conversation. I'm not anti-AI by any means, but this is about your personal agency. You're not passive users, and you're learning how to think with these tools, and to use these tools, right? But it's a two-way street, and you have to establish the boundaries and the relationship that you want to have. And we do that through thinking critically about how we want to use this tool in our own lives. So I think we can all agree that generative AI is absolutely incredible. What it can accomplish and the amount of information that we all have access to is unheard of. Never before in the history of humankind have we had this kind of access to pretty much any information known to man. But with that power comes great responsibility. For all of you Spider-Man fans out there, we all know that line, right? With great power comes great responsibility. ChatGPT and others like it, they can write code, they can simulate a therapy session, they can create a rap song in the style of Shakespeare, they can pass bar exams, SATs, even MBA finals, right? They can replace a lot of what we work so hard to learn, and it's all at our fingertips. But here's the problem. AI doesn't actually understand anything. Tools like ChatGPT, they're trained to predict the next word, not to understand truth. And that opens the door to some major ethical dilemmas. So let's talk about it. In early 2004, there was a law firm that used ChatGPT to help draft a legal brief. Sounds great. Well, the problem is that the AI made up several fake court cases. The lawyers never fact checked it, and they submitted the brief to a federal judge. Well, the judge found out. Obviously, fines were issued and reputations were damaged. It's a bad day, right? Well, the lesson here is that AI can sound really confident and still be completely wrong. And that's a big deal. It's not just in law, but in education, medicine, journalism, and even in our learning. Okay? What we're describing here is AI hallucinations. Now, to understand that, we need to understand how AI hallucinations occur. AI models are trained on data and they learn to make predictions by finding patterns in the data. However, the accuracy of these predictions often depends on the quality and completeness of the data. If the training data is incomplete, it's biased, it's otherwise flawed, then the AI can pick up incorrect patterns, and this leads to inaccurate predictions or hallucinations. An AI model that's trained on a data set of medical images may learn to identify cancer cells, right? But if the data set doesn't include images of healthy tissue, the AI model may not correctly predict that healthy tissue is cancerous. Let's take it a step further than that. The other thing that happens as part of AI hallucinations is that they can take different forms, and that's where it gets interesting. Because you can have incorrect predictions. So an AI model may predict that an event will occur when it's actually unlikely to happen. You also have false positives. When working with an AI model, it may identify something as being a threat when it's not. An example of that would be AI being used to detect fraud may flag a transaction as fraudulent when it's not. I'm sure some of you may have had that when you go to make a transaction or a purchase and it gets flagged as fraud, and then you have to text and authorize the transaction. There's also false negatives. So an AI model may fail to identify as something as being a threat when it is. So an example of that would be an AI model that's used to detect cancer may fail to identify a cancerous tumor. Now, AI hallucinations mean that sometimes and AI will give you a response that you feel confident in because the way it describes it, the way it's written, it makes sense. It seems valid, but it's not. And oftentimes the information could be just made up. Now, there's a lot of ways to prevent this, right? So one of the ways that a lot of research companies now are using is limiting possible outcomes. Okay, so they say that basically there's only a certain number of possible outcomes that the model's allowed to predict. And this is done through what's called regularization. Regularization penalizes the model for making predictions that are too extreme. And this helps to prevent the model from overfitting the data and making incorrect predictions. Now, the other option is to train your AI with only relevant and specific sources. That's when you specialize, right? You upload information that we know to be true, we know to be accurate, and train it solely on this information. Now, both of these models can be advantageous, but there are still limitations to it. For instance, if you train AI only on specific data, you can run into the AI inheriting our own cognitive biases. But we're going to talk about that more later. Now, jumping into this a little bit further, let's talk about the cognitive offloading and something called metacognitive laziness. So, what happens when we rely on AI for our writing, our homework, or test prep? Well, there's a recent research paper that has recently been announced by MIT that I actually will be sharing in the course. And for your reference, I created a podcast off of this source, off of this article, so that you don't have to read the entire research paper, but rather you can listen to a discussion of it that examines some of the impacts of what was found. But this research paper explored how students use ChatGPT in academic settings. And one of their key findings was that many students experience what researchers called metacognitive laziness. So instead of thinking through problems, reflecting, and engaging with the course content, students started outsourcing the heavy lifting to AI. In other words, they stopped learning how to learn. One of the participants said that I used ChatGPT to write my essay. It was fine, but honestly, I don't remember what it said. That's really interesting. That's a powerful statement, and it's a bit scary. When the work no longer feels like your work, you lose ownership, you lose connection, you lose the very thing that college is supposed to build, which is intellectual growth. The goal is for you to learn how to think through and solve problems, to learn how to learn. And if we're offloading that skill set to AI, then we start to lose that ability as humans. Well, when that happens, we undergo what's called homogenization, right? AI, because it's trained on data, often becomes an echo chamber, right? Where you can put in an answer, and because it's been trained on so much data that predicts the same response, you start to get the same answers. You only hear one side of the story. So that brings us to the topic of biases, fairness, and echo chambers, right? So when we talk about biases and fairness, AI models are trained on human data, and that can be from anywhere. We're talking everything from Reddit threads to Wikipedia to news archives, and everything that you see on Twitter. This means that they inherit all of our biases, our prejudice, whether that's gender bias, racial bias, cultural stereotypes, political assumptions. If you take a moment and go through your Instagram feeds, I'm sure you'll find examples of AI describing or AI videos depicting certain cultural stereotypes. These are examples of biases being inherited from us to AI. Now, when we ask ChatGPT for neutral information, it doesn't really know what that means. Again, it's not a thinking or understanding entity. So, looking at a real world example of that, back in 2023, researchers discovered that when prompted to generate images of a CEO, an image generator overwhelmingly produced white male figures. When asked for a nurse or secretary, it skewed heavily female. And I want to be clear, AI is not sexist, It's merely a reflection of the data that it's been trained on, data that's soaked in historical inequality. Now, you want to go a step further? When students only use AI to explain complex ideas, they unknowingly get one-sided answers. They may not be wrong answers, but they're narrow, they're flattened, they're devoid of cultural nuance, philosophical depth, the things that make us human, which is there's always, I'm sure you've heard the saying that there's three sides to every story. There's reality, there's this individual and this individual's side of the story. And increasingly, it's important for us to be able to identify truth and to be able to see things in a holistic manner, not from just one side or one argument. Now, the other big thing that oftentimes is overlooked when it comes to the use of generative AI is the hidden environmental costs. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the environment. So every time we type a prompt into ChatGPT, there's a server somewhere that's crunching your request. It's using electricity, it's generating heat, and oftentimes that's powered by fossil fuels. This all takes place in what's referred to as data centers. Now, data centers have been around for decades at this point, especially since the advent of the internet, and have expanded rapidly. But the computing power that's required to use generative AI versus just traditional search engines is an order of magnitude greater. In fact, some of the articles that we're going to discuss, Google really digs into how much energy it requires to respond to a Gemini or their generative AI prompt versus a traditional Google search. In fact, I think it's something like 3 times more per search. The other thing that we have to consider is that training models like ChatGPT, we'll use GPT-4, for example, uses millions of gallons of water to cool data centers and uses the same amount of energy that multiple cars will produce in their entire lifetime. Microsoft's Iowa facility alone used nearly 12 million gallons of water in a single month. So while using AI feels fast, seamless, and in the cloud, it's not without consequences. AI has a carbon footprint, a water footprint, and growing infrastructure demands that raise serious questions about sustainability. We discussed this more in some of our reading assignments this week, so please take special care to read those and understand it. So now that we've talked about some of these topics, what are we supposed to do? What do we do about all this? I want to be crystal clear. I'm not telling you not to use AI. I use it. You're going to use it. You probably already have been using. And it's absolutely going to improve your learning and your life. But what I am asking you to do is to use it with intention. Think about how you're using it. And here's a couple of principles that we can really take a step back and adopt, right? So you can use AI to think with, not instead of your brain. So start your work first. Let AI refine it, not replace your effort. You can use it as a framework. You can use it as someone to bounce ideas off of or something to bounce your ideas off of, but it should not replace your free thinking, your cognitive effort. Verify everything, okay? Don't assume it's correct. Google it, cross-reference it, think critically. When I was in school, Google was coming out, and a lot of times our professors required us to actually go and reference the material that Google was providing. And for me, that was a big learning experience because at the time, Wikipedia was something new. And yes, I'm dating myself here, but Wikipedia was something new and everyone wanted to use it in our assignments. Well, the reality is it wasn't really a reputable reference site, right? So just like at that time, we have to trust but verify. Now, be transparent. If you used AI to get started or brainstorm, say so. There's no shame in that. It builds trust. It shows that you can understand the technology, and it also shows that you are still putting forth the effort. The other thing I do want to talk about in a little bit more detail is protecting your data. Now, this is a principle that's really, really important, but I want to explain to you why. It's important that you don't put sensitive, private, or proprietary content into public AI tools. Now, why does that matter? Everything that you put into, say, ChatGPT as a traditional user, unless you have a government, education, or Teams account, is going to be used to train the AI model. So all of your most private, personal, sensitive thoughts will be used to train the AI. Now, to me, I'm a person that believes in personal privacy. So it's important that I understand, especially when using ChatGPT, that anything I put in there can become public record. In fact, Sam Altman, founder of OpenAI, stated that anything put into ChatGPT is legally admissible. It can be pulled up in a court case. There are no legal protections for that information. So it's very important that you protect yourself and don't put sensitive, private, or proprietary content into public AI tools. Think about the cost of AI. And we're not just talking about the environmental cost, but the intellectual one. Okay. Every shortcut has a trade-off. One of my best friends is notorious for telling me, Matt, there's no free lunches. Make sure that the way that we're using AI is in alignment with our personal goals. Okay. We want to make sure that it's worth it in the way that we use it. Final reflections on this topic. I want you to think about this. AI is a reflection of us. It's not inherently good or bad, but it is incredibly powerful. And that means it's shaped by the values that we bring to it. And that's important because if we don't use AI appropriately, we don't use it properly, we don't input the proper values that benefit us as individuals, as a society, and as a species, then it can very rapidly shape the world around us in a negative manner. So as you go through this week's readings and discussions, I want you to ask yourself, how do I want to use this tool? What do I want to protect? My learning, my voice, my integrity, my creativity, whatever that may be. What do you want to create? What do you want to protect? And then finally, what kind of AI user and human do I want to be? So I want to thank you all for making it through the lecture. Thank you for showing up to this conversation. These decisions matter, especially at a societal level. And I'm not just talking about for your grade, but for your personal growth and for the world that we're going to build together with AI. So I'll see you on the discussion board. If you have any questions, concerns, or thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out. I look forward to working with all of you this week. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.